Tonight, you are stepping into two stories, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky and The Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Not merely two famous novels, but two extended meditations on what it means to be human when the world itself feels fractured, when inherited beliefs no longer hold, when suffering appears arbitrary or unjust, and when cruelty seems to flourish while integrity is quietly punished. These are not books that comfort easily. They do not offer simple heroes or tidy moral resolutions. Instead, they ask the reader to linger inside uncertainty and to confront the possibility that clarity, if it comes at all, emerges only through struggle. Written decades apart by different men under radically different historical pressures, these novels nonetheless revolve around the same unsettling question. How should a human being live when the foundations of meaning begin to crumble? Both stories emerge from Russia, a land shaped by long winters, political upheaval, spiritual yearning, and a tradition of moral seriousness that refuses to separate philosophy from everyday life. In Russian literature, ideas are not abstractions, they are lived, suffered, and paid for in flesh. Neither novel offers heroes in shining armor. Instead, they give us broken families, compromised institutions, persecuted artists, and frightened bureaucrats, people caught inside systems larger than themselves, systems they may hate yet continue to sustain. One story unfolds slowly and relentlessly within a single family corroded by neglect, resentment, and pride. The other erupts into spectacle and satire, as the devil himself arrives in a modern city to expose hypocrisy with laughter, terror, and absurdity. Together, The Brothers Karamazov and The Master and Margarita stand as monumental achievements of Russian literature, offering complementary visions of faith, doubt, freedom, guilt, love, and the possibility, however fragile, of redemption. First, let's begin with The Brothers Karamazov. To begin with Dostoevsky is to begin at the level of the soul. The Brothers Karamazov is not simply a novel about a crime, it is a novel about what makes crime possible. It fuses family drama, psychological realism, philosophical debate, and spiritual inquiry into a single, sprawling narrative that refuses to separate thought from action. Often described as Dostoevsky's masterpiece, the novel gathers and deepens the central themes of his entire career. Earlier works explored guilt, punishment, alienation, and belief. The Brothers Karamazov expands these concerns outward, asking how personal failures echo through families, communities, and generations. The novel's urgency cannot be separated from the life of its author. Written in the final years of Dostoevsky's life and serialized in 1879–80, The Brothers Karamazov represents the culmination of decades of suffering and reflection. By this point, Dostoevsky had survived a mock execution, years of hard labor in Siberian prisons, chronic epilepsy, crushing debt, and profound personal loss. These experiences shaped his belief that suffering is not incidental to human life but central to it, and that any serious account of faith must withstand confrontation with despair. Dostoevsky had seen ideology, rationalism, and political certainty promise salvation and deliver brutality. As a result, his novels insist that ideas must be tested not in theory but in lived experience. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky revisits themes from earlier works: radical doubt, criminal guilt, spiritual rebirth, humiliation, and pride, but enlarges them into a panoramic vision. He once remarked that he wanted to portray the whole of Russia in a single family, and the Karamazovs become exactly that, a moral laboratory in which conflicting worldviews collide. At the center of the novel stands Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, a grotesque and corrupt landowner whose failure as a father sets the tone for everything that follows. Vulgar, greedy, and emotionally absent, He treats his children as inconveniences and rivals rather than responsibilities. His moral emptiness becomes the negative force against which all his sons define themselves. Dmitri, the eldest, lives in a state of emotional extremity. He is impulsive, sensual, and driven by honor and shame, swinging violently between generosity and self-destruction. He fears that he has inherited his father's depravity and often behaves as though determined to prove it. Ivan, the middle brother, embodies the modern intellectual conscience. Brilliant, articulate, and deeply compassionate, he nonetheless rebels against a God who permits the suffering of innocent children. His skepticism is not casual disbelief but a moral protest that leads him toward nihilism and spiritual crisis. Alyosha, the youngest, begins the novel as a novice monk and seems at first the least dramatic of the brothers. Yet he gradually emerges as the novel's quiet center of gravity. His faith is not naive or abstract, it is expressed through humility, attentiveness, and what Dostoevsky calls active love, a willingness to bear others' burdens without demanding certainty in return. Surrounding the brothers is a dense network of secondary characters who intensify the novel's moral tensions. Grushenka, desired by both Fyodor and Dmitri, embodies wounded pride and the longing to be loved. Katerina Ivanovna, Dmitri's fiancée, is bound by duty, pride, and self-sacrifice in ways that entangle her emotionally with both Dmitri and Ivan. Father Zosima, Alyosha's spiritual elder, offers teachings about forgiveness and universal guilt that ripple through the novel long after his death. And Smerdyakov, the quiet servant and possible illegitimate son, absorbs ideas without compassion, turning philosophy into a weapon. Then we come to a sort of book within the book. The Grand Inquisitor is a key, standalone interruption in the Brothers Karamazov where Ivan Karamazov narrates a long poem in which Jesus returns during the Spanish Inquisition. He depicts a powerful cardinal who secretly condemns Jesus for granting humanity freedom, arguing that people prefer security and authority over liberty. The piece culminates in a nocturnal visit, where the Inquisitor tells Jesus that humanity rejects his message and burdens people with too much choice. Jesus remains silent, and when he kisses the Inquisitor at the end, the dialogue ends with a paradox. Faith and freedom clash against institutional power and human longing for meaning and protection. The Inquisitor argues that people would rather be guided and controlled than bear the weight of freedom, challenging the novel's debate about whether liberty or order better serves human happiness. The parable reframes traditional Christian authority, asking whether institutions can or should mediate divine love without suppressing genuine belief or moral autonomy. The monologue embodies Ivan's atheistic nightmare, the idea that human flourishing requires surrendering freedom to a powerful, benevolent force, posing a radical challenge to Christian ethics and social order. As the narrative progresses, private resentments harden into public conflict. Financial disputes between Dmitri and his father intertwine with sexual jealousy and wounded pride, creating an atmosphere of barely contained violence. Dmitri repeatedly threatens to kill Fyodor Pavlovich, making his guilt seem inevitable long before the murder occurs. When Fyodor is found dead and robbed, the town quickly converges on Dmitri as the obvious culprit. His erratic behavior, previous threats, and sudden access to money all appear damning. Dostoevsky carefully constructs the case so that legal guilt feels almost unavoidable, even as deeper moral questions remain unresolved. Yet the truth, when it emerges, is more unsettling than a simple crime of passion. The murderer is Smerdyakov, who interprets Ivan's assertion that if there is no God, everything is permitted as permission to act. Ivan, though absent at the moment of the crime, is crushed by the realization that ideas can kill. His intellectual rebellion has escaped the realm of debate and entered the world of blood. The trial that occupies the novel's final section becomes a spectacle not only of law but of storytelling. The prosecution constructs a compelling psychological portrait of Dmitri as a man driven by greed and lust to murder his father. The defense attempts to dismantle this narrative, appealing to uncertainty, contradiction, and Dmitri's capacity for remorse. Despite Ivan's fragmented testimony and Smerdykov's suicide, the jury convicts Dmitri. Legal judgment fails to align with moral reality, exposing the limits of institutional justice. Dostoevsky does not allow the reader the comfort of certainty. Instead, he forces us to confront a world in which innocence and guilt overlap, and punishment does not neatly correspond to responsibility. At its deepest level, the Brothers Karamazov is a sustained meditation on faith under pressure. Ivan's rebellion against God, his refusal to accept a harmony purchased at the cost of innocent suffering, stands as one of literature's most devastating critiques of religious consolation. Alyosha's response does not refute Ivan's arguments. Instead, it offers an alternative grounded in compassion rather than explanation. Closely tied to this is the novel's insistence on freedom and responsibility. Dostoevsky rejects both moral relativism and determinism. Human beings are free, and therefore responsible, not only for their actions but for the ideas they endorse, the silences they keep, and the evils they tolerate. Redemption, when it appears, comes through suffering transformed into love. Dmitri dreams of regeneration through exile. Grushenka grows capable of selfless compassion. Alyosha channels grief into care for children, especially the dying boy Ilyusha. The novel ends not with resolution but with a fragile hope rooted in memory, solidarity, and moral attention. Now, on to The Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. If Dostoevsky turns inward, descending into the psychological and spiritual depths of the individual conscience, Bulgakov turns the world upside down. Where the Brothers Karamazov advances through dense realism, philosophical dialogue, and moral introspection, The Master and Margarita bursts into satire, fantasy, grotesque comedy, and theological play. The contrast is immediately striking, but the underlying seriousness is no less profound. Bulgakov's novel asks a question that Dostoevsky could not yet have imagined in full historical form. What happens to truth, conscience, and imagination in a society that officially denies the spiritual dimension of human life and enforces that denial through fear? Bulgakov began writing The Master and Margarita in the late 1920s and continued revising it until his death in 1940, during the height of Stalinist repression. Soviet cultural life at this time was governed by rigid ideological orthodoxy, and writers were expected to produce works that affirmed official doctrine rather than explore moral or metaphysical truth. Bulgakov's own career was marked by censorship, bans, and humiliation. His plays were removed from theaters, his prose suppressed, and his name became associated with political unreliability. He lived in a state of professional limbo, neither fully imprisoned nor allowed to publish freely. This condition of silencing without execution profoundly shapes The Master and Margarita, which portrays not only overt cruelty but the quieter violence of enforced conformity. The novel remained unpublished during Bulgakov's lifetime. His widow preserved the manuscript in secret, revising and safeguarding it for decades. When the novel finally appeared, first in censored form in the 1960s and later in its complete version, it carried with it the aura of survival. Like the Master's burned manuscript, the novel itself had endured erasure and returned. The novel opens with a deceptively casual conversation between two Soviet literary figures debating whether Jesus ever existed. Their smug certainty is interrupted by a mysterious foreigner, Professor Woland, who calmly undermines their assumptions and predicts a death that immediately comes to pass. Woland's arrival destabilizes the novel's world at every level. He is the devil, yet he behaves with a strange dignity and coherence absent from the bureaucrats and critics around him. Accompanied by his surreal advisor, Koroviev with his manic irony, Behemoth the anarchic talking cat, Azazello the demonic enforcer, Woland transforms Moscow into a stage on which hidden vices are exposed. The supernatural chaos that follows is not random. Through black magic performances, disappearances, and grotesque punishments, Bulgakov exposes greed, cowardice, opportunism, and moral emptiness within Soviet cultural institutions. Those who exploit others, collaborate out of fear, or abuse power are humiliated or destroyed. Those who retain compassion or courage, however compromised, are treated with a surprising degree of mercy. Satire here becomes a form of moral revelation. In a society that denies the existence of good and evil as metaphysical realities, Bulgakov reintroduces them through laughter, terror, and absurdity. Woland does not so much corrupt Moscow as reveal what it already is. Against this public spectacle stands the novel's most fragile figure, the master, an unnamed writer who appears first in a psychiatric clinic after suffering a complete psychological collapse. His crime is not political agitation but truth-telling. He has written a novel about Pontius Pilate that refuses ideological simplification, portraying power, cowardice, and moral compromise with unsettling honesty. The master is destroyed not by a single tyrant but by a system of critics, committees, and ideological gatekeepers who weaponize ridicule and denunciation. His decision to burn his manuscript and retreat from the world reflects a deeper tragedy than censorship alone, the internalization of fear. The regime does not merely silence him, it persuades him to silence himself. In this sense, the master represents the artist under totalitarianism, crushed less by physical violence than by the systematic erosion of confidence, meaning, and hope. His belief that his work is worthless is the regime's greatest victory. If the master embodies artistic vulnerability, Margarita embodies moral courage. Trapped in a loveless but privileged marriage, she refuses the safety of conformity in favor of loyalty to truth and love. When Azazello offers her supernatural power, she accepts, not out of ambition, but out of desperation and devotion. Margarita's transformation into a witch and her flight over Moscow are moments of ecstatic liberation, but they also reveal her ethical core. At Satan's ball, where she serves as hostess to history's murderers and monsters, she endures humiliation and horror without cruelty or bitterness. When granted a wish, she chooses mercy for another condemned woman before asking for the master's return. This choice is crucial. Margarita is not redeemed by purity but by compassion. Bulgakov overturns traditional moral binaries. Dealing with the devil does not damn her, because her actions remain guided by love and pity rather than power. When Woland restores the master's burned manuscript, declaring that manuscripts don't burn, the line resonates far beyond the plot. It becomes a defiant statement about the endurance of truth under repression. Art, Bulgakov suggests, may be silenced temporarily, but it cannot be annihilated. More than this, the manuscript's survival implies that stories themselves participate in moral reality. The master's novel does not merely describe Pilate's guilt, it ultimately helps resolve it. Art, in this vision, possesses the power not just to represent truth but to complete unfinished moral histories. Threaded throughout the novel is the master's retelling of Pontius Pilate's encounter with Yeshua HaNotzri, Jesus. Pilate is portrayed neither as villain nor hero, but as a man trapped by fear. He recognizes Jesus' innocence and longs to save him, yet sacrifices truth to political stability. Pilate's punishment is not eternal fire but endless remorse, a torment that mirrors the psychological suffering of those who betray conscience for safety. His eventual release, granted not through justice but through mercy, completes the novel's moral arc. Even the gravest failure may be answered, someday, by compassion. The novel concludes on a deliberately restrained note. The master and Margarita are granted peace rather than divine illumination, retreating into an eternal twilight beyond the reach of ideology, censorship, or fear. Their reward is not triumph but rest. This ending resists both utopian optimism and total despair. The world remains broken. Evil is not abolished. But suffering is eased, love is honored, and memory endures. Placed side by side, the brothers Karamazov and the Master and Margarita reveal themselves as radically different responses to the same enduring moral problem. How should human beings live when traditional sources of meaning, God, justice, social order, are fractured, denied, or corrupted? Both novels begin from a recognition of moral crisis. In Dostoevsky's Russia, faith is eroding under the pressure of rationalism, social inequality, and intellectual pride. In Bulgakov's Soviet Union, faith has been officially outlawed, replaced by ideology and enforced disbelief. Yet in both worlds, the attempt to eliminate metaphysical questions only intensifies them. Each novel insists that evil is not merely an external force but something that spreads through ideas, omissions, and acts of cowardice. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan never murders his father, yet he cannot escape responsibility for the crime made possible by his philosophy and withdrawal. Smerdyakov acts, but Ivan authorizes the action in spirit. In The Master and Margarita, Bulgakov broadens this logic to an entire society. Belayo's smug atheism, the critic's cruelty, and the bureaucrat's opportunism do not directly kill, but they create a moral vacuum in which destruction flourishes. Woland's punishments expose not innocence corrupted, but corruption already present. Both novels therefore reject simplistic divisions between villains and victims. They argue instead for a more unsettling truth, that most harm is enabled by ordinary people who prefer safety, status, or certainty over conscience. The formal differences between the novels are not merely aesthetic, they reflect distinct philosophical strategies. Dostoevsky's realism forces readers to inhabit moral conflict from the inside. Long conversations, psychological breakdowns, and courtroom debates compel us to feel the weight of choice and consequence. Bulgakov, by contrast, employs fantasy and satire to break through ideological denial. His talking cats, flying witches, and demonic theatrics do not distract from reality, they reveal it. In a society where truth cannot be spoken directly, the fantastic becomes the most honest mode available. In both novels, love emerges as the most credible form of resistance to despair. Alyosha's love is quiet, patient, and communal, directed toward children and the suffering rather than toward abstract ideals. Margarita's love is fierce, risky, and personal, willing to confront hell itself for the sake of another. Neither form of love saves the world, but both preserve something essential within it, the refusal to treat human beings as expendable. Finally, both novels place extraordinary weight on memory and storytelling. Alyosha's final speech urges children to remember moments of goodness as a defense against future despair. Bulgakov's assertion that manuscripts do not burn affirms that truth, once spoken, leaves traces that power cannot fully erase. In this sense, both Dostoevsky and Bulgakov suggest that moral survival depends not on certainty, but on remembrance, on holding fast to stories, relationships, and moments of compassion when systems fail. Neither novel concludes with redemption in any triumphant sense. Dmitri remains condemned. Ivan is broken. The master and Margarita retreat rather than return to the world. Yet both endings preserve a fragile hope grounded in responsibility and love rather than victory. Dostoevsky leaves us with children and memory. Bulgakov leaves us with rest and mercy. Together, they suggest that while evil may be inevitable, indifference is not, and that even in the darkest conditions, how we choose to love, remember, and speak still matters. What gives the Brothers Karamazov and the Master and Margarita their enduring power is not merely that they dramatize crises of faith in their own eras, but that they anticipate the moral landscape of our own secular age with unsettling precision. We now live, largely, in a world Ivan Karamazov would recognize, a world in which inherited metaphysical certainties have weakened, where appeals to transcendence are often viewed with suspicion, and where moral language persists even as its foundations are contested. We continue to speak of justice, dignity, and human rights, yet struggle to explain why these values should command loyalty beyond preference or consensus. Dostoevsky foresaw this tension with terrifying clarity. Ivan's rebellion is not simply against God, but against a moral order that demands faith in the face of innocent suffering. What Dostoevsky exposes is the cost of winning that argument. When metaphysical guarantees are rejected, moral responsibility does not disappear, it intensifies. Without God, there is no cosmic accounting to absorb guilt. The burden of meaning falls entirely on human choice. Modern secular life often attempts to escape this burden by outsourcing responsibility to systems, legal frameworks, bureaucratic procedures, economic incentives, algorithmic governance. Like Pilate washing his hands, we reassure ourselves that no individual is to blame, only processes, policies, or historical forces. Bulgakov's Pilate is therefore not a relic of antiquity, he is a prototype. He is the administrator who knows the truth, feels discomfort, and nevertheless signs the order. What both novels insist upon is that moral catastrophe rarely begins with hatred. It begins with abdication. In Dostoevsky, this abdication takes the form of intellectual retreat. Ivan refuses responsibility not for the crime itself, but for the world his ideas help create. His tragedy is modern, the belief that one may critique injustice without incurring obligation. Yet ideas, once released, do not remain contained. They seek embodiment. In Bulgakov, abdication appears as conformity. The critics who destroy the master do not see themselves as villains. They are merely following norms, protecting careers, repeating approved phrases. Totalitarianism succeeds not only through terror, but through the quiet internalization of fear. When people learn to censor themselves, power no longer needs to shout. Our own age, for all its freedoms, is not immune to these dynamics. Social pressure replaces state terror, reputational risk replaces imprisonment. The mechanisms differ, but the moral temptation is the same. Silence is safer than truth, alignment easier than conscience. Against this backdrop, the forms of resistance these novels propose are strikingly modest. Neither Dostoevsky nor Bulgakov offers political blueprints or utopian solutions. They do not promise that love will defeat evil, or that truth will inevitably prevail. Instead, they narrow the field of responsibility to what remains possible even when systems fail. For Dostoevsky, this means active love, attention to the concrete suffering of others, refusal to reduce human beings to categories, and willingness to accept guilt that cannot be rationally apportioned. Alyosha does not solve the problem of evil. he chooses not to add to it. For Bulgakov, resistance takes the form of memory and art. Manuscripts don't burn is not a romantic slogan, it is a moral claim. Truth persists not because it is powerful, but because it is remembered, retold, and protected by those willing to bear its cost. The master survives not by triumphing over the regime, but by refusing to let fear have the final word over meaning. What unites these responses is their rejection of innocence. Neither Alyosha nor Margarita is pure in any simplistic sense. They are not saved by moral perfection, but by fidelity, to love, to truth, to the irreducible value of particular human lives. In a secular age, this may be the hardest lesson of all. Without divine guarantees, morality becomes fragile, contingent, and demanding. There is no final harmony to justify present suffering, no external authority to absolve complicity. There is only the ongoing task of choosing, again and again, whether to participate in cruelty, indifference, or fear, or to resist them in whatever limited ways remain. Dostoevsky and Bulgakov do not reassure us that meaning will survive history. They ask something more difficult, whether we will. In the end, both novels leave us not with answers, but with a charge. Remember. Pay attention. Refuse abstraction. Love without certainty. Speak when silence would be easier. In a world where God may be absent and justice unreliable, these acts, small, vulnerable, and costly, become the last offenses of the human soul. Thank you for listening.